Welcome back, everyone, and if you're new here, I'm so glad you found the channel. We're on an exciting journey to reach 10k subscribers by next year, and every like, comment and subscription brings us one step closer. Your support means everything. Now, let's jump into today's video. The crisp mountain air bit at my face as I gazed up at the towering peaks of the Andes Mountains, their snow-capped summits disappearing into the clouds above. My name is Lena Carter, and I've spent the last 15 years of my life preparing for this moment. The jagged rocks and steep cliffs before me held secrets that had remained buried for centuries, waiting for someone brave enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to uncover them. I adjusted my worn leather jacket, a gift from my father before his last expedition to these very mountains. He never returned from that journey, but his research notes and journals led me here, to this remote location where ancient civilizations once thrived and vanished without explanation. The documentary crew behind me was setting up their equipment, their cameras, ready to capture what I hoped would be the archaeological discovery of the century. "Dr. Carter, we should set up base camp before the sun sets," called out Evan Sinclair, our team's geologist. His skeptical nature had always been both a blessing and a curse during our previous collaborations. We'd known each other since our graduate school days, and while his scientific rigor kept us grounded, his dismissal of local legends and folklore often created tension with our guides and informants. I turned to watch the rest of our team organizing their gear. Dr. Felix Hayes, our historian, was already buried in his notebooks, his silver-streaked hair wild in the wind, as he muttered to himself about ancient texts and forgotten rituals. His obsession with the region's dark history had initially concerned me, but his knowledge was unparalleled. Maya Gupta, our cryptographer, stood slightly apart from the others, her dark eyes scanning the mountain faces as if they held messages only she could read. Her ability to decipher ancient scripts and symbols had made her invaluable to the expedition, though lately I'd noticed her growing increasingly withdrawn. Our guide, Izzy, was securing the climbing equipment with practiced efficiency. Her family had lived in these mountains for generations, and her knowledge of the terrain was exceptional. However, when I first shown her the coordinates of our destination, she'd grown pale and quiet. It took a considerable persuasion and an increased payment to convince her to lead us there. The documentary crew, a 3-person team from a prestigious network, worked quickly to capture the magnificent backdrop and our initial setup. They'd been following our preparation for weeks, turning our academic pursuit into what they hoped would be compelling television. Their presence added an extra layer of pressure to an already tense situation. As we began establishing our base camp, the sun cast long shadows across the valley below. The temperature dropped rapidly, reminding us of the harsh environment we'd be facing. Our high-tech equipment and expensive winter gear seemed almost insignificant against the ancient majesty of the mountains. That first night, gathered around the campfire, Dr. Hayes shared his research about the civilization we were seeking. The pre-Incan peoples who lived here weren't just primitive tribes, he explained, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. They possessed knowledge and technologies that we still can't fully comprehend. But more importantly, they had rituals, ceremonies that they believed could bridge the gap between our world and something else entirely. Maya, who had been quietly translating some newly discovered markings in her notebook, looked up sharply. "The texts I've been studying mention a specific site," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They call it the Temple of the Undying One. The translations are difficult, but they speak of a power that sleeps beneath the mountain." Evan scoffed, poking at the fire with a stick. "Every ancient civilization had their myths and monsters. It's how they explained natural phenomena they didn't understand." Izzy, who had been silent until then, spoke up. "These mountains have their own will, their own spirits. My grandmother used to tell me stories about places we shouldn't go, things we shouldn't disturb. There are caves in these mountains that have never known sunlight, and there are reasons why they remain hidden. The wind picked up suddenly, sending sparks flying into the darkness. In the distance, something that might have been a rockfall echoed through the valleys, though the sound seemed to last longer than it should have. The documentary crew exchanged glances, clearly pleased with the atmospheric tension they were capturing. That night, as I lay in my tent, reviewing my father's old journals, I found myself drawn to his final entries. His normally precise handwriting had grown erratic, and his descriptions of what he'd found became increasingly confused. The last page contained a warning that I'd dismissed as the ravings of a mind affected by altitude sickness. The eyes in the dark are watching. They've always been watching. Don't let them see you too. I was startled from my reading by a sound outside my tent. A soft scraping, like stone against stone. When I checked, I found nothing except fresh snowfall and what looked like unusual depressions in the ground, too large to be footprints, but too regular to be natural. By morning, they had vanished, filled in by the continuing snowfall. The next day dawned clear and cold, perfect for beginning our ascent. As we packed our gear and prepared for the climb, none of us could have known that we were about to embark on a journey that would change us forever, in ways that no amount of academic preparation or physical training could have prepared us for. The mountains held their secrets close, and as we would soon discover, some secrets are better left buried in the eternal ice and snow of the Andes. Our journey upward began at dawn. The morning sun painted the snow-capped peaks in shades of rose and gold, creating an illusion of warmth that the biting wind quickly dispelled. The documentary crew struggled with their equipment in the thin air, but managed to capture stunning footage of our ascent through the rugged terrain. The first signs that something was amiss came around midday. Maya, who had been documenting ancient markings along our path, called the team over to examine a particularly unusual set of carvings. The rock face was covered in elaborate symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. Dr. Hayes became visibly excited, his hands trembling as he traced the patterns with his fingers. "These aren't like anything I've seen in my research," he muttered, frantically sketching in his notebook. The style predates known pre-Incan civilizations by centuries, possibly millennia. Look at the depth of the cuts. These weren't made with bronze or stone tools. Evan crouched down to examine the rock face more closely. "The erosion patterns don't make sense," he said, frowning. "These markings should have weathered significantly at this altitude, but they look almost fresh." Izzy stood back from the wall, her face a mask of concern. She muttered something in her native tongue before speaking to us. "My people have stories about markers like these. They say they appear before..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Before the mountain wakes up." The camera crew zoomed in on the markings, their lenses capturing details our eyes might have missed. Later, when reviewing the footage, we would discover that the symbols appeared blurred and distorted in every frame, as if they refused to be documented. As we continued our ascent, the air grew thinner and the sky darker, despite it being early afternoon. The wind carried strange sounds, whispers that seemed just on the edge of comprehension. Maya began to fall behind, frequently stopping to press her hands against her temples. "Does anyone else hear that?" she asked during one of our rest breaks. "It's like singing, but not quite. Like voices speaking words that almost make sense." Dr. Hayes nodded enthusiastically. The ancient texts speak of mountain songs, voices that call to the faithful. This could be evidence of acoustic phenomena described in the original manuscripts. But I noticed the fear behind Maya's eyes. This wasn't academic excitement. Something was genuinely disturbing her. By evening, we reached a natural plateau that would serve as our advanced camp. As we set up our tents, Evan discovered something in the rocky ground. A perfect circular hole, about 6 inches in diameter, that seemed to descend endlessly into the mountain. When he dropped a light stick into it, we never saw or heard it hit bottom. The documentary crew was ecstatic about the discovery, but Izzy's reaction was immediate and severe. She demanded we move our camp at least 100 yards away from the hole. "These are the breathing places," she explained, her usual composure cracking slightly. "The old ones said they are how it tastes the air, how it knows we're here." That night, the temperature dropped well below our equipment's rated specifications. Frost formed inside our tents, creating intricate patterns that seemed to depict scenes of ancient rituals. The wind died completely, leaving us in a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure against our eardrums. I was awakened in the darkest hours by the sound of crying. Following it, I found Maya sitting outside her tent, tears frozen on her cheeks. Her laptop was open beside her, displaying photographs of the symbols we'd found earlier. "They're not just writing," she said without looking up. "They're a record, a warning. I've been cross-referencing them with known pre-Columbian scripts, and there are similarities, but..." She turned the screen toward me. "Every culture has these symbols, buried in their oldest texts. They all tell the same story about something that sleeps in the mountains, something that wakes up hungry." Before I could respond, a deep tremor ran through the ground beneath us. From the direction of the circular hole, we heard a sound like a long, slow inhalation. All around our camp, the snow began to melt in perfect circles, revealing not rock beneath, but smooth, dark stone that seemed to have been carved with purpose. Dr. Hayes emerged from his tent, his excitement palpable. "Do you realize what this means?" he whispered, his breath visible in the frigid air. "We're standing on it, the temple complex, the entire mountain peak, isn't natural at all. It's built around something, hiding it." A sudden gust of wind brought with it a scent that didn't belong at this altitude, the heavy, organic smell of decay. One of the documentary crew's cameras inexplicably turned itself on, its night vision mode active, revealing dozens of similar holes in the rock face above us, each perfectly circular, each bottomless. None of us slept for the remainder of the night. We huddled in the communal tent, listening to the mountain's unnatural silence, broken only by occasional sounds that might have been the wind, or might have been something drawing long, slow breaths in the darkness. Morning arrived with an unnatural stillness. The sun seemed dimmer somehow, its light struggling to penetrate a haze that hadn't been there the day before. As we emerged from our tents, we found our equipment covered in a fine, black powder that disappeared when touched, leaving no trace on our fingers. The documentary crew's cameras had captured something during the night, strange lights moving across the mountain face, following patterns that matched the circular holes we'd discovered. The footage showed the lights converging at a point about half a mile up the slope, in a section of the mountain we hadn't yet explored. Dr. Hayes was already preparing his climbing gear. "We need to investigate that area," he insisted, his usual scholarly composure replaced by barely contained excitement. "The patterns match descriptions in the oldest texts. The lights are markers, showing us the way." Evan, typically the voice of scientific skepticism, was unusually quiet as he studied the rock formations through his binoculars. "There's something wrong with the stratification patterns," he finally said. "The entire face we're looking at. It's not natural. It's been worked, shaped somehow. But the tool marks would have had to have been made thousands of years before the earliest known civilizations in this region." Izzy stood apart from the group, her face ashen. "This is as far as I go," she announced, her voice firm despite her obvious fear. "My grandmother told me stories about this place, about the lights that lead people to the sleeping one's mouth. Those who follow them never return." The documentary crew was divided. Their producer wanted to continue filming, but the camera operator and sound technician were openly discussing abandoning the project. The atmosphere of dread had become almost palpable, hanging over us like a physical weight. Maya approached me privately, her laptop clutched to her chest like a shield. "I've finished translating more of the symbols," she whispered. "They're not just warnings. They're a record of something that happened here, something that the ancient peoples did or tried to do. The texts talk about binding a being that came from the stars, something that could wear human flesh like clothing." Before I could respond, a deep rumble shook the mountain, causing loose rocks to clatter down the slope. When the dust settled, we saw it. A dark opening in the rock face that hadn't been there before, its edges too smooth to be natural. The black stone around it was carved with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed directly, forcing the eye to slide away. The opening was perfectly aligned with the point where the lights had converged in the night footage. Cool air flowed from its depths, carrying that same organic, decay-like scent we'd noticed before. Our equipment began to malfunction, compasses spinning wildly, electronic devices displaying impossible readings. Dr. Hayes was already moving toward the cave entrance, his academic caution completely abandoned. "This is it," he called back to us. "The temple complex the text described, the place where they performed the binding ritual." The documentary producer followed him, camera in hand, but stopped short at the entrance. The lens had cracked in a perfect spiral pattern, though she swore she hadn't dropped it. Despite Izzy's warnings, and my own growing sense of dread, we began preparing for cave exploration. The possibility of finding evidence of an unknown civilization, and perhaps understanding what happened to my father, overrode my instinct to retreat. We divided our remaining equipment among the team members who agreed to continue. Myself, Dr. Hayes, Evan, Maya, and 2 of the documentary crew. Izzy agreed to wait at the camp for 24 hours before going for help if we didn't return. As we prepared to enter the cave, Maya pulled me aside one final time. "The translations," she said, her voice shaking. "They keep changing. Every time I look at my notes, the meanings are different, but they all end the same way, with a warning about waking something that hungers for more than just flesh, something that feeds on the very essence of what makes us human." The cave entrance seemed to swallow light itself, our high-powered beams barely penetrating the darkness beyond. As we crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped sharply, and I could have sworn I heard something that sounded like distant laughter echoing from the depths. The walls were covered in carvings more intricate and numerous than any we'd seen before. They depicted scenes of ritual sacrifice, of beings that seemed to shift between human and inhuman forms, and of something vast and dark descending from the stars. The deeper we went, the more disturbing the carvings became, showing transformations and fusions of flesh that defied natural law. The passage began to spiral downward, leading us deeper into the mountain's heart. The air grew thicker, filled with dancing motes of that same black powder we'd found on our equipment. Our lights caught glimpses of movement in the shadows, but whenever we turned to look directly, there was nothing there except more carvings that seemed to have changed position since we last looked at them. The first real sign that we'd crossed some terrible threshold came when we heard Dr. Hayes' voice echoing from a side passage we hadn't noticed before. The problem was Dr. Hayes was standing right next to me, yet his voice called out from the darkness, begging for help in a tone of pure terror. "That's not possible," Evan whispered, his skepticism finally cracking. "Sound doesn't carry like that in these formations." Maya had pressed herself against the wall, her eyes wide with recognition. "The texts mentioned this. Voices that steal voices, shadows that learn to speak. They're part of its hunting strategy." The documentary crew's remaining camera was capturing strange distortions in the air, like heat waves in a desert, but the temperature had dropped so low, our breath was forming ice crystals that hung suspended unnaturally long before falling. As we pressed deeper into the cave system, the passages began to take on impossible geometries. Tunnels that curved left somehow brought us back from the right. Downward slopes led us up, while upward climbs left us deeper than before. The carvings on the walls became more elaborate, depicting scenes that made several of us nauseous just by glancing at them. Then we found the first body. It was perfectly preserved in the cold, dry air. A man in outdated climbing gear, his features frozen in an expression of absolute horror. Next to him lay a journal, its pages brittle with age. My hands trembled as I recognized the handwriting. It was my father's. The last entry was dated exactly 15 years ago. The words were barely legible, scrawled in desperation. It doesn't just kill, it keeps you, makes you watch as it wears your flesh, uses your voice to lure others. I can feel it trying to hollow me out to make room for itself inside my mind. If anyone finds this, run. What sleeps here was never meant to wake. Before we could process this discovery, a deep rumble shook the entire passage. The sound of stone grinding against stone echoed from all directions, and the tunnel behind us collapsed, cutting off our retreat. The only way left was forward, deeper into the mountain's heart. Our helmet lights began to flicker and die, no matter how fresh the batteries. The darkness pressed in around us, thick and almost liquid in its consistency. The documentary producer's camera caught strange images in the infrared spectrum. Long, fluid shapes moving through the rock walls themselves, always just at the edge of visibility. The passage eventually opened into a vast chamber that defied all logic. Our remaining lights couldn't reach the ceiling, but they revealed rows upon rows of stone pillars, each carved with scenes that seemed to move when caught in our peripheral vision. The air was thick with that black powder, which now glowed faintly with its own inner light. At the chamber's center stood an altar, a massive block of that same black stone, its surface covered in stains that looked disturbingly fresh, despite their obvious age. Surrounding it were hundreds of human skulls, arranged in intricate spiral patterns that seemed to draw the eye inward, creating vertigo-inducing sensations of movement. Dr. Hayes approached the altar in a trance-like state, his flashlight beam revealing something resting on its surface. A stone idol about the size of a human head, carved from a material none of us recognized. It depicted a being that seemed to shift and change as we looked at it, its features never quite the same twice. "The Undying One," Maya whispered, her voice filled with horror, as she translated the inscriptions around the altar's base. The texts call it the hunger that walks in flesh. They didn't bind it here, they summoned it. The entire mountain is one massive containment structure built to keep it sleeping. The temperature in the chamber plummeted suddenly, our lights dimming to almost nothing. In the darkness, the idol's eyes began to glow with a deep, pulsing red light. Dr. Hayes reached out to touch it, ignoring our shouts of warning. The moment his fingers made contact, he went rigid. A sound escaped his throat, not a scream, but a high, keening noise that no human vocal cords should have been able to produce. His body began to twist, the bones beneath his skin shifting and reforming as something else took control. The last thing we saw before our lights failed completely was Dr. Hayes' face splitting into a wide, impossible grin, his eyes now glowing with that same red light as the idol. When he spoke, it was with a voice that contained echoes of thousands of other voices, all screaming in unison. "I have waited so long," the thing wearing Dr. Hayes' flesh said, "so many centuries alone in the dark, but you have finally come to free me, just as I knew you would." The chamber erupted into chaos. The documentary producer's camera exploded in a shower of sparks, and the sound technician's equipment emitted a piercing shriek that brought us to our knees. In the strobing light of our failing equipment, we saw Dr. Hayes' body continuing to change, his limbs elongating, and skin rippling as if something massive was moving beneath it. Evan grabbed my arm and pulled me toward one of the chamber's exits. "Run!" he shouted, his voice nearly lost in the cacophony of grinding stone and inhuman whispers that filled the air. Maya was already sprinting toward another tunnel, while the documentary crew scattered in panic. Behind us, Dr. Hayes' laughter echoed off the walls, but it wasn't just his voice anymore. I heard my father's voice in that laugh, and the voices of countless others who had vanished in these mountains over the centuries. The sounds seemed to come from everywhere at once, disorienting us as we fled blindly through the darkness. The tunnels had changed. What had been a straightforward descent was now a maze of twisting passages that seemed to breathe and pulse around us. The black powder in the air grew thicker, making each breath feel like drowning. Our flashlights cut through the darkness in weak, sickly beams that revealed glimpses of movement in every shadow. "This way," Maya called out, her voice trembling but determined. She had her laptop open as she ran, its screen casting an eerie blue glow. The carvings, they're not just history, they're a map. The people who built this place left instructions for sealing it again. A horrible scream cut through the darkness, the sound technician's voice coming from somewhere behind us. There was a wet, tearing sound followed by silence. Then his voice came again, but wrong, distorted, calling out to us, "Please help me. I'm hurt. Don't leave me here." "Don't listen," Maya shouted. "It's learning, adapting. It uses their voices to..." Her warning was cut short as something dark and fluid shot from the wall, wrapping around her ankle. She fell hard, her laptop clattering across the stone floor. Evan and I rushed to help her, but stopped short as we saw what had grabbed her. It looked like a human hand, but it was emerging directly from the solid rock, its flesh merging seamlessly with the stone. More hands began to emerge from the walls and floor, dozens of them, each belonging to someone the entity had absorbed over the centuries. They reached for us with desperate hunger, their fingers elongated and joints bending in impossible ways. Maya kicked free and scrambled to retrieve her laptop. The screen was cracked but still functioning, displaying translations of the symbols that lined the tunnel walls. "There's a sequence," she gasped. "The original builders created a way to reinforce the binding, but it requires..." The rest of her words were drowned out by a deafening roar as the tunnel behind us collapsed. Through the falling debris emerged the thing that had once been Dr. Hayes. His body had grown to impossible proportions, his skin now translucent and revealing writhing shapes beneath. His face had split vertically, opening into something like a flower made of teeth and eyes that glowed with that same malevolent red light. "Your species has always been so clever," it spoke through multiple mouths, each one moving independently. "Building your little cages, thinking you could contain something that existed before your world had form. But you never understood. I let you bind me. Sleep was peaceful, and time means nothing to my kind. I knew eventually you would return, bringing the means of your own undoing." The entity reached out with one grotesquely elongated arm, its fingers splitting and multiplying like branches of a dead tree. Where they touched the walls, the stone seemed to liquefy, revealing more faces pressing through, hundreds of them, all victims of the creature over the millennia. We backed away, but the tunnel ahead of us began to shift and close. Maya frantically typed on her damaged laptop, trying to decipher more of the symbols. "The binding ritual," she said, her voice shaking. "It needs a sacrifice freely given, blood offered willingly to reinforce the seals." The thing that had been Dr. Hayes laughed again, the sound rippling through the air like oil on water. "Yes, tell them, little scholar. Tell them the price of containing me. Show them what their ancestors understood, that there must always be a guardian, a consciousness kept aware through the long dark to maintain the binding. Your father understood this, Lena. He chose to join us rather than let me wake fully." My heart stopped as one of the faces in the wall shifted, forming into my father's features. His eyes opened, and they were filled with that same red light. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," he spoke, his voice a horrifying mixture of his own and something ancient and alien. I couldn't stop it alone, but now you're here. In that moment of horror, Evan made his decision. He grabbed the laptop from Maya's hands and sprinted towards the entity, shouting over his shoulder, "Get to the surface, I'll hold it back." The creature's attention shifted to him, its multiple mouths spreading into grotesque smiles. The walls rippled like liquid, hands and faces pressing through the stone, reaching for him. Evan dodged them, his years of climbing experience making him surprisingly agile even in this nightmare. "The binding ritual needs a conscious mind," he called out, "someone aware to maintain it. I'm a geologist, who better to become part of the mountain." His voice cracked with fear, but his determination never wavered. Maya grabbed my arm, pulling me towards a narrow crevice that had opened in the wall, a way out that hadn't been there before. "He's creating a distraction," she whispered urgently. "We have to go now." But I couldn't move through the writhing mass of faces in the wall. I kept seeing my father's features emerge and disappear, his eyes pleading with me. The entity's influence was growing stronger. I could feel it pressing against my mind, showing me visions of power and knowledge beyond human comprehension. "Your friend's sacrifice would be wasted," the thing wearing Dr. Hayes' flesh said, its voice now a symphony of everyone it had absorbed. "Even if you escape, I am already awake. The binding weakens. Soon I will spread beyond this mountain, and your world will remember what it means to know true fear." The chamber shuddered, and more of the ceiling began to collapse. Through the falling debris, I saw Evan reach the altar. He had Maya's laptop open, reading from the translations, as his free hand pressed against the idol. The red glow from its eyes intensified, and Evan's skin began to ripple as the entity's influence spread through him. But something was different this time. Evan wasn't screaming in horror like Dr. Hayes had. Instead, he was reciting something under his breath. Equations and formulas, the basic laws of geology and physics, scientific principles that defined how the world worked. The entity's movements became more erratic, its many mouths twisting in what looked like pain. "You don't belong here," Evan said through gritted teeth, his voice still his own. "This world has rules, laws that even you must obey. Mass cannot be created or destroyed. Energy must be conserved. You want to wear our flesh? Then you have to play by our rules." The entity shrieked, a sound that made my ears bleed and my vision blur. The faces in the walls began to contort, the hands pulling back into the stone. Dr. Hayes' transformed body started to collapse in on itself, the extra limbs and mouths folding into impossible angles. Maya was frantically taking photos of the wall carvings with her phone, backing toward the exit. "The original builders," she gasped. "They didn't just bind it with sacrifices, they bound it with understanding. Knowledge is power, and human knowledge can cage even gods." The thing that had been Dr. Hayes lunged at Evan, its body now a twisted mass of flesh and shadow. But as it touched him, something extraordinary happened. Instead of being absorbed, Evan stood his ground. His skin had begun to take on the texture of the cave walls, but his eyes remained his own. "Run!" he shouted, his voice echoing with both human and inhuman tones. "I understand now what your father did, what all of them did. It needs consciousness to maintain its form, but consciousness goes both ways. We're not just its prison, we're its jailers." The entity roared in fury, but Evan's transformation was spreading, his body becoming one with the mountain itself. The stone around him shifted, new symbols carving themselves into the walls. I recognized them. They were chemical formulas, geological terms, the language of modern science mixing with the ancient warnings. Maya pulled me towards the exit again, and this time I followed. Behind us, Evan's voice echoed one last time, now resonating with the same power as the entities. "Go. Tell them why this place must stay sealed. Tell them what sleeps here. and why it must keep sleeping. We ran through twisting passages that were rapidly sealing themselves behind us. The black powder in the air thinned, then disappeared entirely. The sounds of combat behind us faded, replaced by a deep rumbling, as the mountain itself seemed to shift and settle. When we finally emerged and into the open air, the cave entrance was gone, sealed so perfectly it was impossible to tell it had ever existed. The sun was setting, casting a blood-red glow over the snow. In the distance we could see Izzy's camp, a tiny point of light in the gathering darkness. But we weren't the same people who had entered that cave. Maya's phone, when we checked it, showed only corrupted files where the photos should have been. The only evidence we had was my father's journal, its pages now filled with a mixture of his original notes and new writings that seemed to have appeared on their own. Warnings and instructions for future generations. That night, as we huddled in Izzy's camp waiting for rescue, we heard it. A deep, rhythmic sound from within the mountain, like a heartbeat, or perhaps like breathing. But it was weaker now, more contained. Sometimes in the wind, I thought I could hear Evan's voice reciting the laws of physics, like a mantra, keeping our world's rules intact against something that never belonged in it. Maya spent the night transcribing every symbol she could remember, her hands shaking but determined. "People need to know," she said. "Not everything, that would be too dangerous, but enough to stay away, enough to understand why some mountains should remain unclimbed, some secrets left buried." I opened my father's journal one last time and found a new entry had appeared. Written in Evan's familiar handwriting, "The price of containment is eternal vigilance. We are the wall between worlds, the barrier of consciousness that holds back the dark. Let those who come after us read these words and heed them well. Some things must sleep forever, and we are their keepers." The rescue team found us 3 days later. We told them there had been a cave-in, that we had lost the others in a tragic climbing accident. What else could we say? How could we explain that somewhere in the heart of the mountain, our friends and my father were still conscious, still human enough to maintain their eternal vigil against something that wanted to unmake reality itself? But sometimes when I dream, I can still feel it. The entity, pressing against the walls of its prison, testing the barriers of science and sanity that keep it contained. And sometimes I hear the voices of its jailers, my father, Evan, even Dr. Hayes, all of them working together now, using their combined knowledge of our world's rules to keep that ancient horror bound. The documentary footage was lost, of course. The equipment all mysteriously failed, but I still have my father's journal, and Maya has her translations. We've made copies, hidden them in secure places, because we know that someday someone else will be drawn to these mountains, drawn by the same whispers that called to us. And when that happens, they'll need to know. They'll need to know why some doors must stay closed, why some peaks must remain unclimbed, and why, in the highest reaches of the Andes, there sleeps something that must never, ever wake.